Hello, everyone. This is Bill Lacey with the Dole Institute of Politics. I'm delighted to say that today we're joined by Francesca Chambers, who is the McClatchy News Service White House correspondent and a former KU student. Welcome, Francesca.
Thank you, Bill. This is a real pleasure because normally I'm the one interviewing you.
Yes, that's very definitely the case. Let's start today. Tell us a little bit about where you're from and how you were brought up.
So I'm from Paola, Kansas. I'm a Kansas native, and then I went to the University of Kansas and I studied journalism and political science there. And you and I, of course, met when I was a part of the Dole Institute of Politics on the Student Advisory Board. But of course, then we had this unique opportunity to get to know each other a little bit better when you were running a presidential campaign, and that's why I had the chance to interview you all those years ago, which, one could say, Bill, you gave me my big start covering presidential campaigns in that unique sense. And so I have, of course, went on now to interview a number of presidential candidates themselves, as well as their senior aides. And now I cover the White House from McClatchy, as you noted. And for those who aren't aware, in addition to all the other amazing publications we own around the country, we also own the Kansas City Star. And so it has been an amazing experience to be able to get to write for what I consider to be one of my hometown papers. I say one because, of course, the paper in my hometown of Paola is very special to me, as well as the Lawrence Journal-World. But the Kansas City Star, being someone who was born in Kansas City, Kansas, is a very cool place to work and be able to ask questions of White House officials for the Kansas City Star, in addition to the Charlotte Observer, the Miami Herald, and the Sacramento Bee, and other papers that McClatchy owned across 30 states.
Oh, that's fantastic. I forgot that you interviewed me when I was on the Fred Thompson campaign, right?
That's true. I was being serious about that when I said that was what I believe was my first time interviewing a senior official or a campaign manager for a presidential campaign. So that's why I said I could give all credit to you, Bill. Here we are now.
I think you made it on your own. You've done a great job. Tell us about your other jobs in journalism after graduating from KU.
So for a time, I did some web editing, one could say. Back in the day, web editing was a little different than it is now. What I mean by that is I got a gig at the Washington Examiner, putting other people's stories online, because that was the job that was available, and you have to start somewhere. And so then I was able to work up from there. And then I joined dailymail.com as a political reporter. But the real reason I had wanted to take that job was because they were starting up their operations in the United States, and really anything was open. I said, could I go on to cover the White House in this job? And they said, we don't really have an infrastructure or an office. It was me and the bureau chief. And so it was choose your own adventure. So I thought that was a good idea and decided to take that job. And I spent 5.5 years there, because first I did 6 months of general political reporting. Then I had wanted to cover the White House. So I just went to the White House and went to the briefing room and started attending briefings, and then said, okay, I guess now is the time for me to say I'm an actual White House correspondent after a couple months. And so then moved fully into reporting on just the White House and presidential campaigns. And I see them as very similar in the sense that there's the road to the White House, and then there's the White House, and then you're on the road to the White House all over again. And so covering Barack Obama the last 2 years of his presidency, and moving into covering first Republican presidential candidates that year, but then eventually moving over to Hillary Clinton and Democratic presidential candidates. And then I was in bed on Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign and Bernie Sanders as well. The way we had it set up, I did some Clinton and some Sanders, and then back to Clinton when she was, of course, the Democratic presidential nominee that year. And then went back to covering the White House full time. I was certainly covering it still then, but President Barack Obama was really yielding to Hillary Clinton at a certain point when she was the nominee, and so was more on the campaign trail than out at the White House, but certainly covered the final months of his presidency. And then, of course, the transition into Donald Trump's presidency, and I'm still covering the White House now.
Do you enjoy covering the White House more or working or covering a campaign more?
Ooh, I like them both for similar reasons, but also different reasons. So, of course, it's nice to have the stability of being able to be at home in Washington, D.C. with my husband and my cats, who I mentioned because they're probably going to make an appearance at some point in this broadcast. They're very curious. So maybe you'll get to meet them. But at the same time, I love traveling, absolutely love traveling. And I've found it such a cool experience to get to know presidential candidates before they become the nominee or before they become the president of the United States, at a time when they're still gaggling and taking questions from reporters at almost every event because they just want the airtime. And that is such a cool opportunity to be able to question them and to follow someone from start to finish too, and see how the campaign evolves and grows, and they as candidates too. And that's also really beneficial for once someone gets in the White House or gets reelected in the White House, is having built those relationships from the ground up. And so in 2016, of course, Hillary Clinton did not get elected, and neither did Bernie Sanders. But Bernie Sanders did run for president again. And so having had those relationships already, I was able to resume them. And I was originally covering Bernie Sanders' reelection, as well as some of the other Democratic presidential candidates, when I was still at dailymail.com. When I came to McClatchy, mostly, almost totally fully transitioned, of course, into just the White House and just the Trump reelect campaign. But those relationships don't go away. And so they have been really useful when I am writing stories about Trump, the Trump campaign reelect, to be able to call up those Democratic sources for my stories.
Sounds great. Sounds really great. Now tell me, kind of two questions here. What was your average day like before the pandemic, and now what's your average day like? How is the pandemic affecting your job?
Well, certainly I'm spending less time at the White House and more time at my house. And I'm someone who spent a lot of time at the White House before, so that's unique for me. But it is, of course, I'm sure as everyone who's watching this is finding, there are also upsides to being able to work from home, because you can make calls all day long to people, and you don't have to worry like I did at the White House. I mean, all my competitors also have desks nearby. And so arranging those calls when it's something that I don't want them to find out about until I've had a chance to print it can be a challenge sometimes. So in working from home, that's less of an issue. On the other hand, being at the White House every day gave me a lot of opportunities to interact with senior officials like Larry Kudlow, who likes to talk to reporters outside, Kellyanne Conway, Peter Navarro, some of those folks who you could just walk up to after their television hits. They would also speak to print reporters. And now if you're at home, of course, you don't have the same access to senior officials, and you have to rely a lot more on emails and phone calls, which of course they do not have to answer. So that of course proves to be a challenge. But I have actually found that many people in the political sphere have been really great about hopping on the phone and responding to emails and being interviewed, because they understand the situation that we're all facing.
Yeah, I've been able to watch the task force news conferences most every afternoon from the White House. I notice you're getting lots of chances to ask questions. You must be very pleased about that.
I think it's a real honor to be in the White House press corps and have those opportunities. And I think there's also a huge weight, though, that falls on your shoulders in determining what to ask that day, what's important to the readers of McClatchy, what's important to Americans who were watching these like you are. And that's how they're getting their information about the coronavirus. And so it is definitely one of those situations where with great opportunity comes great challenges. I'm not sure if I'm phrasing that right, but that's the idea behind it. And so yesterday, for instance, I had the opportunity to ask the vice president about Kansas's governor, Laura Kelly, and the request she said that she had put into FEMA for additional supplies from the federal stockpile. And this was something that I had never seen happen before. After I asked the vice president if he had had any contact with her, because the White House and President Trump and Vice President Mike Pence say that they're constantly talking to governors, he told me that he hadn't talked to her or heard from her directly, and that he was going to call her. That he was going to call her to ask her about the supplies that she says that she said she wasn't getting that I told him about. And so that was just an example of how important the questions can be at times to the president, to the vice president, and to the White House. And so I'm very much looking forward to finding out whether or not, from my colleagues who cover the Kansas legislature, whether or not that call took place.
Yeah, I thought that was an excellent question too yesterday. I really appreciate your time. Just have one final question. What would you say to students? You were a student about 10 years ago. What would you say to students who are thinking about getting involved in journalism or thinking about a career in Washington, D.C.?
If that's what you want to do, you should absolutely go for it. And don't let the economic circumstances dictate what you're going to do. I think early on, that was something when I graduated, we were coming out of an economic downturn. And it was something that really weighed on my mind was the cost of living here, whether or not it's something that, I really thought that I could do is move to Washington, D.C. full time. But I did it. I just jumped right into it. And the path that got me to the White House was actually not the path necessarily that I saw myself taking. It wasn't the way that I wanted it to go. And I think that that's, looking back, something I realize now, which is that the path is not as straightforward as you want it to be many times or as you hope it will be, but that doesn't mean that you can't get to where you want it to be. And so even when it feels challenging, particularly for people who might be graduating right now and you're trying to figure out how you're going to get a job and where you're going to get a job, like, don't give up on it if it's something that you're really, really passionate about. Because if you're very passionate about it and you're good at it, then it will generally and usually work out for you. And that would be my advice, whether or not you're wanting to move to Washington, D.C. or New York or just somewhere else. We need smart K graduates working in all kinds of industries and all kinds of places, not just in Washington, D.C., in politics or in journalism.
Okay, Francesca, thanks so much for joining us today. I know you got your hands full with those briefings every day and everything, and it's so great to have a KU student and a Dole SAB student as my first interview as part of this series. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Bill.
All right, take care.